Hi, everybody. Thanks for choosing to view our presentation. We're here to talk about ChatGPT and its relationship with online learning and assessment. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm here with Morgan Luo, PhD student. We're with the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University in the Department of Instructional Systems Technology. This presentation was delivered on March 3rd, 2023 at the annual IST conference. So why all the fuss about ChatGPT, and what do you mean by ChatGPT versus learning? Well, as most of you likely know, ChatGPT has generated massive amounts of attention. I initially at one point said it was more attention than any other development in educational media, and Jeremy Rochelle said, no, more attention than anything in the history of computer science. It's a big deal. ChatGPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, version 3.5 we're currently at. The reason it's such a big deal is they released this with a simple interface, very easy to use, and it's generated just endless debates over the impact on teaching. This is an article that caught my attention early on and a lot of other people in the Atlantic, The End of High School English. The author explains how he took a presumably unhackable prompt that required students to put two literary works in conversation with each other and discovered that ChatGPT was extremely good at that sort of task. And this resulted in a backlash. No, ChatGPT is not the end of high school English. And this has gone back and forth. So we're here to talk about that today. What is the nature of this debate? How concerned should we be? Also want to point out that remarkably little of this consideration has focused on K-12 learning, and a lot of it has not specifically concerned online learning, which has surprised me a bit since so much assessment is taking place online, and a lot of assessment that went online in the pandemic was attempting to stay online in the pandemic, and a lot of that has now been thrown into question thanks to ChatGPT. First off, I want to caution everyone. Um, a bunch of authors raced out with new books. You can see all of these were published, uh, very recently. Several of them are available for free. It turns out they were all written by ChatGPT, as far as I can tell. Bit of a scam. Some of them, they've been giving them away for free in order to get their rankings up in Amazon, and then they start charging for them. Here's one that I actually did go ahead and spring for. Said, well, if I pay $5, am I going to get anything more? And it turns out even the introduction was only 25% human generated content. So that's my first piece of advice: is be really careful looking at recently published books in response to these questions that are coming up. So getting a little more serious, some of my colleagues in the learning sciences have been very involved, and we're already involved in generative AI. This AI is generative. It's a large language model, and this has been a subject of study within computer science and learning sciences actually for quite some time. Folks like Victor Lee has been doing interesting work, got quite a bit of interesting press and some media accounts, and some good ideas and insights. Marcella Worsley has been involved in a really interesting project going forward, really looking at the consequences of AI for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jeremy Rochelle at Digital Promise, a really interesting blog post from him where he's speculating about chat algebra, right? So if you think about what a challenge algebra is and speculate, it's really not that difficult at all to imagine a very similar thing to ChatGPT that works in algebra, and what does that look like and how does that work? And then finally, my IU Learning Sciences colleague Cindy Mello Silver is one of the co-investigators of the National Science Foundation's AI Institute for Engaged Learning. And when I approached Cindy and really all of these colleagues about doing a pre-conference workshop at the upcoming Learning Sciences conference, Cindy said, yeah, I will, but let's look beyond this sort of bright, shiny new object. And I think she's absolutely right. These folks have been studying it and will continue studying it. I'll be honest with you, Morgan and I are primarily focused on the immediate term consequences. I'm on a college-wide panel. I'm on a university-wide panel. I'm meeting with, in fact, Morgan and I are on both of those panels, and then I'm on a meeting with some folks at a medical school next week who are desperately trying to figure out how to respond. So there's really a demand, most of you know. I know that we presented at the Digital Learning Annual Conference last week, and the interest in the ChatGPT sessions was just enormous. And so a lot of people are really concerned about what to do in the short term. And so I'm going to present some data and some initial analyses looking at sort of the immediate and sort of medium term implications and consequences and responses to ChatGPT in the classroom as it relates to both the design of assignments and the design of assessments. Our blog is called Remediating Assessment. You can find it there. We cranked out 4 separate blogs in response to the explosion of interest. One of them is a relatively up-to-date summary of podcasts if you're interested in learning by listening. But we also did a really systematic analysis of the media. And on January 5th, there were several dozen, and there's a lot more now, as we'll show. In fact, recently we were up to 213 media accounts. These included sort of just news accounts, descriptions, predictions of generative AI as they relate to learning. Again, most of these concerned post-secondary education, and very few of them were explicitly interested in online learning, but most of them were also implicitly concerned with online assessment and worrying, for instance, whether or not we go back to what the British called the invigilated exams, the sort of proctored exams. Surprisingly, relatively few of them talked about sort of the elephant in the room, and that is whether or not instructors resort to these intrusive and expensive digital proctors. Morgan will be presenting this afternoon on this very topic, and we know from working with the high school teachers who we work with that they've said, at least one of them said, the English teachers said, oh yeah, this is all the more reason to be using proctors. I'm not grading anything that's not proctored because I just don't trust anything that I don't see the students writing. And so that's another kind of a separate issue, but it certainly is worth one talking about. We've tried to make sense of this 200 media accounts. We dual coded them on 3 dimensions. First of all, do we include? Are they relevant to education? Most of them were. That was an easy one. We were quite reliable. Then the learning impact ranging from very negative to very positive. We decided to split apart learning impact to schooling impact because in many of the articles they really diverged. So schooling impact is, let's not worry about it. This isn't going to be any different than, than Wikipedia. Somewhere between Wikipedia and calculators versus massive impact. Everything you're going to have to do differently. So we were able to get relatively reliable on scoring these 200 articles and media accounts on those 2 dimensions. We resolved our differences by negotiation. We ended up including 195. The overall mean learning impact was 2.95. So that's really close to the middle of that scale, which is comparable to mixed neutral. And this really makes sense because a lot of these accounts were in fact media accounts that tended to give both sides, the pros and cons. Yeah, here's what some people say and here's what other people say. Overall schooling impact, this is on a 4-point scale, right? That's a 5-point and a 4-point scale, so they're different scales. The schooling impact was 2.73, which is almost to significant impact. So we tried to analyze this relatively messy body. First, we looked at by venue to see whether different sort of sources of information were uh, imagined a more negative or more positive impact and a little or no schooling impact. Um, Couple of noteworthy things here. The standalone blogs, right? See, these are knowledgeable. We didn't include a lot of these because they seemed like one-offs, but the ones that were recommended widely and that were had many posts, we see that the 14 of them that they actually were much more positive compared to the affiliated blogs. Those 17 were somewhat lower in terms of their learning impact, or somewhat more negative. The schooling impact was not that really very different for them. The other really noteworthy finding, though, I think, is lower down. The 43 educational media accounts were much less concerned about the impact on schooling. What you tended to see in the educational media was, hey, the mainstream media is freaking out. Don't worry, this isn't going to be the end of the world. This is going to be a little more than slide rules and calculators. Um, Finally, university centers. We looked at these because, well, we were interested in them. We'll be returning. That seems like some of the most important sets of concerns and recommendations of all. That's cut off on the slide, but there was 13 of those. So when we broke this out further, we looked at, for example, the political orientation. Like everything these days, it's getting taken up in the partisan politics of the day. The National Review went in and sort of, uh, when they couldn't get it to say that Joe Biden lost the election and other similar things, they claimed in a massively cited piece that ChatGPT is woke. Um, and indeed, we see that the 12 conservative media venues um, were more negative about the impact on learning than the few liberals outlets, and we're much more concerned about the impact on schooling. When we compared the U.S. versus the international, we see that the international community was more negative and not much different in terms of schooling impact. We're considering systematically analyzing the recommendations, but it's really pretty messy. I think we're going to focus on the analyses that I'll be showing you. Lots of empirical studies coming forward. Most of them are in preprint now. Many of them are analyses showing that ChatGPT is a pretty good student when it comes to high stakes exams like med school and law school. Now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about these specific recommendations. About 50 or 60, depending on how we analyze it. A little hard to code this kind of data. Make the recommendation that the problem isn't really ChatGPT at all. The problem is really that instructors are using prompts for their assessments and their assignments that are too shallow. Arguably, this overlooks something, and that is that you can't simply prompt it to use recent stuff, right? So after 2020, ChatGPT doesn't know that stuff, and it doesn't know specific and local stuff. And that overlooks an important point, that you can provide the information, what I'm begun calling knowledge-rich prompts. And here you see a typical example of this. If ChatGPT churns out a credible essay, it's because schools set an equivalent task. Indeed, here at Indiana University, my friend Greg Searing, who's the director of the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning, one of several recommendations involving redesigning assignments is, again, make assignments reliant on data and context that AI cannot have access to. Very common recommendation. Similarly, John Paul Canwit, who's helping lead a faculty learning community, presented last week. He took 3 example prompts from business, English, and education and sort of showed how you might change them to make them more result in a more meaningful question that sort of that thwarts ChatGPT. So I'm going to focus on the business example right now because it really drives home the point that I want to make today. Here's what I'm calling the naked prompt, right? What are Porter's 5 forces? Yeah, some instructors might, ask in an introductory course something that basic, and students repeating it from memory. Well, they've learned something, but indeed, no big surprise. These are the 5 forces for analyzing the competitiveness of an industry or market. And of course, ChatGPT knows what they are. Now, that looks a little too good to be plausible, so you can say, hey, write it like a typical undergraduate business major, and it does. Now, we see that this is actually even less human generated. The previous example was uh, was scored more highly. This one we see that the detector at Writer AI says it was only 9% human generated, but it looks a lot more like what an undergraduate might write. So the revised prompt that came from that presentation said apply Porter's five forces to the fictional or very recent case that we just read. In other words, either make up something, have the students make up something, or come up with a recent case. So we went out and found something, in this case, we published in 2016 something about Airbnb that is kind of obscure and ChatGPT didn't know about it. What I've done here is I've said apply Porter's five forces to the following case, and I pasted the first paragraph of the case into ChatGPT. In other words, even though Chat doesn't know it, if you give it that knowledge, it can interpret it and analyze. Case in point, this is pretty good. This is now. I'd be curious to see what a business instructor thinks, but um, it it's all pretty plausible, right? So it was able to take the knowledge that we gave it, combine it with this sort of naked prompt, and generate a pretty plausible response. So if you have students doing online assignments or online exams and you're not proctoring them, um, even with these more sophisticated prompts, students are going to be able to do this kind of thing, and it's really hard to detect. They can go into the AI detector and change a few words and see what happens to it. So, not the end of the world. And in fact, there's much more to it that I'll come back to about how students can learn from these kinds. And by the way, ChatGPT went ahead and said, "Well, I'm at it. Let me go ahead and give you a solution for each of these things." So ChatGPT, even what it doesn't know, it can figure out a lot of stuff when you get information. So now I want to turn to two other analyses that we did. These are in blog posts at our blog, Remediating Assessment. The first set of analyses, I tried to complete my P540 Learning and Cognition course using ChatGPT. And then in the other one, Morgan and I went in and basically redid my P507 class assessment in schools and side by side put Morgan's response when she took the class in her first semester of graduate school, and then put those side by side with the kinds of responses that ChatGPT generated. I don't have time to go all the way through all of these examples. One of the points I want to make, the first point I want to make, has to do with references. Many people say that ChatGPT hallucinates references, and indeed it does. We read Sinatra, Hetty, and Lombardi in the Learning and Cognition course, and we asked it to talk about using that article to motivate cybersecurity learning. That's a topic that I write about. It's a topic of my term paper that we wrote together in the class. And indeed, it just made it up. It made up those quotes. It made up the actual reference there at the bottom. You can see it said Journal of Educational Psychology. It looks pretty real, but it's totally fake. The actual reference is an actually educational psychologist. Here's the key. If you give it the abstract, so not only have I provided the abstract to the article we read in class, I've got more detail. Describe constructivist approaches to motivating cybersecurity using cyber ranges and digital twins. These are these innovative, hyper-realistic simulations that I'm very interested in. It nailed it. Um, it understood the article, it applied it appropriately to these specific innovations. You see there in the last paragraph, this type of learning approach promotes cognitive engagement where students are actively involved in critical thinking and problem solving. So it did quite a good job with it. Similarly, in the assessment in schools course, One of the first assignments reflecting Randy Engel's principles for expansive framing, we often had students engage in what we call resource ranking, where, okay, the first chapter has 8 what to assess considerations. So given your goals for the course, which of those 8, which 2 are most relevant to you and which one is least relevant? So here we say, so Morgan is indeed an online instructor who teaches English overseas, and ChatGPT just makes them up. Language proficiency, assessment validity, those are not what to assess considerations in the first chapter. Now, an instructor would quickly recognize that right off and understand that as being fabricated. It's worth noting they're plausible, but those are not the actual ones. Here's the trick. You can see that what we've done here is we've given just the titles of the what to assess considerations. Consider decision focus, common core standards, number of assessment targets, right? Those are the titles taken from the book. And ChatGPT nailed it. Those are pretty plausible responses of why somebody who's teaching English overseas would need to decide whether they're doing constructed versus selected response, the decision focus, and that national subject matter organization recommendations wouldn't really matter in an international context. So that's some pretty impressive personalized engagement. So what's the challenge here? What's the question here? This is complicated. This is a lot more than calculators in math class. Um, Now, the issue, of course, is that ChatGPT can learn what it doesn't know. I believe that these examples show that knowledge-rich prompts that students are, if they don't know how to do it, they're going to learn very, very quickly. They can thwart many efforts to use higher level and critical thinking prompts. The real question is, how do we structure assignments and courses so that students can actually learn from what ChatGPT knows? And this is actually a lot more complicated. This is a lot more time consuming. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine that many of the people who are throwing around recommendations for how to do this don't appreciate that most instructors are already maxed out and they don't have time to do some of these much more elaborate kinds of assignments that they're recommending. Now, here's a key takeaway, is that the difference here matters how much you value constructivist inquiry-based learning. Um, Now, in our case, what we saw there is ChatGPT was able to generate a bunch of new knowledge, and the students could actually learn from that knowledge. If those contexts are indeed personally relevant, um, right? Now, one challenge here is that instructors are going to struggle to evaluate engagement that's expansively framed because, right, the students are bringing their own ideas and their own context to bear, and that's really a separate challenge. I think that we address that in the broader assessment framework that Morgan will be talking about in the afternoon at the conference. But the real question is, let's say, for example, a common recommendation is have the students generate 3 or 4 different examples in ChatGPT and then pick the one that they think is the best and explain why. Well, if ChatGPT is answering that question from 2 or 3 different angles and the student is picking one, the student is going to learn from what ChatGPT figured out. And my guess is that this does reflect my own particular theoretical orientation that um, there's definitely something to be learned from the struggle in the inquiry, but it's really time consuming. If ChatGPT can generate 3 or 4 examples for the students to engage with and choose from in the same amount of time, it's entirely possible that the student will learn as much, if not more. So I don't have time to really get deeply into this. We're just getting started with this analysis, but I'm very enthusiastic. My lab, my approach is very enthusiastic about social annotation. Don't use discussion forums. Rather, engage in threaded discussions directly on readings and student artifacts. And Jeremy Dean is the Director of Research at Hypothesis and has this blog post. He's got five recommendations. The first one is writing throughout the course. This makes a lot of sense. I do think that what we learned is that many of the kinds of little bits of writing, yeah, students can still use ChatGPT to do them if they want. Um, it's hard for them to not learn anything, but it's definitely a shortcut. The second one, writing in context. One of ChatGPT's shortcomings is its inability to integrate quotations effectively. We saw that's actually not true if you give the quotations. Um, and it cannot have a conversation with another author or text. Well, I'll let you be the judge. So, Jeremy has promoted this idea along with others in the Perusall and ChatGPT communities. This fantastic idea of annotating the syllabus, right? It's a great way to get students to engage. In my case, have students identify which of the course goals are most relevant to them. So here the prompt was, which are most relevant to a graduate student who teaches cybersecurity online? And I just pasted in the course goals from the syllabus. And it it did it pretty well. It's pretty plausible. I would be I could not tell the difference between that uh, and a real one. So that's an example of the kind of annotation that students might do. Here you see we've the prompt that we gave ChatGPT is a question that a student posted socially annotating one of the readings. Why did the authors omit empiricists and cognitive associationist perspectives when they included them later on? ChatGPT initially failed and said, hey, I don't really understand. I can't answer. Can you say more? Now, you didn't have to repeat the question. You just have to elaborate and say more. Now, you're engaging with that content some. But look at what ChatGPT does. It generates, and especially for a struggling writer, right? One of the things we want students to do is to learn to communicate in writing. This is definitely a shortcut. We can see that ChatGPT really nailed it and produced a really plausible response, perhaps a little too sophisticated. So we've gone in and said, do that more informally. And ChatGPT, of course, just nailed it. So students are learning how to do this. Whether or not they're learning content along the way depends on a lot of complex and important decisions or information we give to students. So there's a lot to learn here, and I'm looking forward to learning with you. If you have questions, you can feel free to email me, dthickey@Indiana. You can email Morgan as well. And there's our blog right there. So thank you for your time and consideration.